Hi, everyone. Great to see you all here today. Thanks for joining us this evening and for making time to be with us all. My name is Leah Keener, and I'm Bay Nature's events coordinator. Just really grateful to see you all and see you supporting our ocean issue talk. So before we begin, I just want to invite everyone who's here to turn their cameras on if they're able. It would be great to see your faces. We'd love to see you, and please engage with us for this hour if you can. If you're not in a place where you can turn your cameras on, that's okay. But if you can, it would be great to see you. Thanks to those of you who've already turned your cameras on. Um, this meeting is being recorded, so no need to worry about that. And those of you who have registered will get emailed a link to the recording later. So don't worry about that. And then if you have any questions during this talk, please just enter them into the chat and we'll get to as many as possible afterward. But before we begin, I just want to give a brief introduction to Bay Nature and to our event program. Many of you probably already know this, but Bay Nature is a quarterly print magazine that comes out every 3 months, focuses on nature and conservation content local to the 9 counties of the Bay Area. We also have our website, which publishes weekly online content only, which is also news that's local to the Bay Area and focuses on similar topics. But in the last few months, we've also been working on building up our event program with virtual events like this one, as well as in-person events that take people to locations and sites that are featured in our magazine and focus on some of the researchers and experts that are highlighted in its pages. So thank you so much all for being here. I really appreciate you sharing the evening with us. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kate Golden, our digital editor, to moderate this talk.
Hello, everybody. It's great to see so many people here. So first, introductions. Want to introduce Tessa Hill, who is a professor at UC Davis in the Earth and Planetary Sciences Department. She teaches and researches on oceanography and climate change topics. And then we have Eric Simmons, wave. He is a science writer, but many of you may know him as a longtime editor at Bay Nature. He's my predecessor, actually. Though lately, we have discovered he is a very brave man because he is teaching high school math. Welcome to both of you, and thank you so much. We are so lucky to have you here today. I want to start by just sharing my screen to kind of focus us all a little bit. Give me 1 second to get the right tab shown here. So this is something I learned about. You seeing a map? Yes, good. This is what is called a Spillhouse projection, kind of like the Mercator projection is a type of map. It's an entirely valid map of the world, and it is the one that you would use if your view of the world was entirely ocean-centric. I learned about it from Tessa and Eric's book, At Every Depth, and it is a great metaphor for the whole book and their project, really, because what they are doing is shaking up how we think about the ocean, or how civilians think of the ocean as a big, blank, empty expanse that's kind of far away from where we actually conduct our real lives. And they are centering it in our lives and showing how important it is. And they do this by filling out the picture of the ocean with characters, not just the creatures, but the scientists and activists who are looking at the ocean deeply, sometimes literally very deeply, and trying to understand what is happening to it and trying to avert the disaster of climate change. And we will get into the book, but before we zoom out to the whole world, I want to start way zoomed into our own patch of ocean around the San Francisco Bay and just offshore. Because, as you probably all know, after writing their book, Tessa and Eric came in and guest edited our summer issue, and they made a whole beautiful ocean issue. Well, I will now exit this. Hang on 1 second. Where is my stuff? 1 second. Technical difficulties. I don't see a stop the page. Hey, um, hmm. 1 second. Hey,
Yeah, you're
did
good.
you
You're good.
unshare for me?
Yes.
Thank you. my button disappeared. Anyway, I wanted to show you the ocean issue. You guys, many of you guys probably already have it. Um, and in this issue, you can find stories about deep sea exploration, about how the ocean is changing, about the science that's taking place to understand it better. But first, before we start getting into that, I just want to do a little icebreaker and ask both of you, Eric and Tessa, if you personally need some ocean time around here, where do you go? And what are you doing when you get there? What does the ocean connection mean to you? Eric, you first.
Okay, so I have two answers to this. One, if you are a long time Bay Nature reader, you may remember I really love tide pools. I think one of the writers in this issue, Mary Ellen Hannibal, has the opening of her book. Her book, Citizen Scientist, starts with I think the first time I reached a flow state was while tide pooling. I've always felt the same way. It is a meditative um, experience unlike any other that I've found where I find myself not able to be distracted. It's one of the few places where my phone does not tempt me, where all the things I'm thinking about don't bother me, where I just sit and look for creatures and think about the creatures and look through kelp and get my hands in the water and of late share that with my children. And I think that if I need ocean time, you will find me probably at Fitzgerald Marine Reserve or at Pillar Point, hanging out. Although the other answer to this is because I went to UC Santa Barbara, I like to be in the ocean too. And I am not as active as I was when I was in college, but I really love to be in the water on a bodyboard or on a surfboard. Those are still things that I find cleansing and they reset everything. Day in the ocean is always a great day. So those are the two places.
Tessa, Tessa, how about you?
Such great answers. So we'll start off with a little known fact about Eric and Tessa, which is that our lives actually crossed at many points. And one of them is that I also went to UC Santa Barbara. And so I also have a real, because of Santa Barbara, but also some other places I've lived, I have a real affinity for being in the water, which is a little bit harder in Northern California, I will admit. But now I have the real joy of working at Bodega Marine Lab. And so I spend a lot of my time in the Bodega area. And so I think if you were to ask me if I needed ocean time during the work week, you will just find me in my office looking out at the Pacific Ocean or right out in front of my office. Um, on the weekend, I like gravitate towards, maybe Dillon Beach or Salmon Creek Beach or something like that. But definitely these Sonoma County beaches pull me in. Love it.
Mm, mm. So, when you guys were curating the topics that would go into this issue, putting the features together, I want to talk about how some of the themes or big takeaways from the book, which ones, like what themes you wanted to bubble up in the issue, what you wanted people to think about. And I thought maybe a fun way to do that would be to start with how you chose the species for the almanac, which of course is something that we always anguish over. If you haven't seen the almanac before, it's a beautiful 2-page spread all the time. And this one, of course, is entirely ocean themed. So just to remind you, in case it's filed and forgotten, it's the Western gull, the Christmas tree coral, the vermilion rockfish, the great white shark, the sea palm, and Ditrichocorycaeus anglicus, which is a copepod, which is a critter in the plankton. So, Eric, I think you spearheaded this. Maybe you
Yeah.
could give us some
I'll
insight into why you chose some of these guys. And I already know you're a shark guy, so
yeah, I mean,
that already had
taking the
that's
big
enough of
answer, which is I wanted Jane Kim to illustrate a great white shark.
that. Yeah.
That one was set. No, partly the great white shark was perfect because this was the fall issue of the magazine, and because they come back in the fall, and because this felt like me coming back to Bay Nature to work on this issue, and it just felt like okay, this is a neat little universal harmonizing, and so the great white shark is going to be at the top. Um, I wanted a coral because I just love corals, and I think it's hard sometimes in the Bay Area to remember that we have this like wealth of deep sea corals all around us. So I wanted to pick something there. We thought seasonal. That's how we ended up with the one we ended up with. The the
And I
plot,
think like
yeah,
a huge theme of the book, as well as, I mean, is just like all of this life that you can't see.
yeah, of course. I mean, I think there's like a broader theme there that is a little bit why it was so fun to work with Bay Nature too, because I think we start the book saying like if this stuff was happening on land, you'd notice it. And I think this group, the Bay Nature community, is a very good one for expressing this because you see if there's been a fire, you see if the trees are sick, you see if there's a new subdivision, all that stuff on land. And I mean, you mentioned at the beginning, like even looking at the map, like I think the New York Times crossword on Monday, there was a clue that was vast blue expanses and oceans. And just like uh, uh, going into that flat blue expanse and turning it into something was what we wanted to do in the book, but also what Bay Nature does with everything. You go into places and you
Hmm.
learn them, and you get to find the corals that are offshore, or the plankton, which we, Kate will tell you as well. We went back and forth on which plankton quite a bit because it was hard to pick one. And the my favorite part of this was like we emailed a couple of plankton guys who research plankton, and they wrote back and was like, well, nobody knows anything about any of them. Just pick one. So that was really fun. I mean, that was again this experience of diving into something, figuring out little things, and then bringing them up, bringing them into Bay Nature. Something only this magazine sometimes gets to do.
You chose the Western gull. Why a trash bird?
Uh,
Not that I think of them that way, but
we
some people do.
we needed character. I think again because everybody sees them. You see them all the time. And it's again, I mean, not to overdo the metaphor, but like you see them everywhere. You see them at the Giants game. You see them at the landfill. You see them, in a sort of nuisance sort of way. They sure hang out at our high school. They're all over the place, and yeah, it's to like know them as an actual creature is less common. You just sort of know them as the trash bird. And
I see the
thank you.
objection. Someone says, Maureen,
Yeah.
I agree. Western gull is not a trash bird.
But
Totally
but
agree.
I yeah, but I think that was the idea there was they have this sort of one thing that you see all the time, and then getting into that second level of understanding them. Part of the
Yeah,
joy again of Bay
yeah.
Nature.
So the biggest theme of your book, of course, is that the ocean is changing very rapidly, and that pace of change seems to even be accelerating, and how the biological and the physical changes are just so deeply intertwined. Mary Ellen Hannibal writes about this in the big feature, in a kind of collage of like what are we learning about the changes, like how the physical and biological are linked. Where do you see that change most visible or playing out most strongly in our local waters? What changes are there but harder to see? Maybe that's a Tessa question. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm pausing to think. It's a great question. I think we see it in so many ways in our local waters, and that article is so lovely and such a what am I trying to say? It has all the things in it that I wish we had had more time to cover in the book. So it's like a really great, like if you read that article and you enjoyed it, you'll definitely, I think, like the book because I see them, at least in my mind, as being very connected thematically. But okay, I'm trying to actually answer your question. Like I mean, we see all sorts of examples of abnormal warming along the California coast, and many different ways that impacts us, even as humans. So I'll just cite a couple of things that people might really remember, which is, for example, the the harmful algal bloom events several years ago that also led to the closure of the Dungeness crab fishery. I feel like part of our culture and customs in the Bay Area is to have that Dungeness crab in winter, maybe even specifically as a Christmas meal. And it does actually feel like something big is happening in the world when we cannot have, when we can't support our local Dungeness crab fishermen. And that has played out even with sort of longer term effects because there have been fundamental changes in where whales are finding their food sources along our coast. And because the whales have moved, they are coming into more and more contact with the Dungeness crab fishery. And so the fishery has been impacted by regulations that, is attempting to keep it away from harming the whales, which of course is very important. But it's this, I think there's actually a quote in our book that basically says this sort of these worries about whales and interacting with fishermen and entangling with fishing gear is sort of a perfect example of like a species at risk that is now being impacted by climate change. Like there's multiple different problems that are layering on top of each other, and we're seeing that happen right in our backyard.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that really struck me in the book was when there was a coral reef scientist um, who had this revelation that all this observation we're doing is not saving the coral reefs. And it kind of, I think she was saying that science is kind of broken, at least the old way of doing science. And I felt like I saw some echoes of that in our story about the Farallones, which is a story about bearing witness to what is happening to the birds of the Farallones, that there is still this huge and magnificent resource of just like bazillions of birds, and we just are kind of watching the warm water come or like, take away their food. And I just wonder if each of you had these thoughts about how science needs to change, or whether society needs to change how it looks at science or something like that. I don't know what.
I mean, yes, we had a lot of thoughts. I mean, the way this book was written was in part like this running dialogue between Tessa and me for I don't know how many years, 6, 7 years, and sending news articles back and forth, and then sort of thinking about them and talking about them. And I think we probably both brought some of our own like personal anxieties, our own personal things, but also ended up just talking about these things that were happening and happening quickly. And the period when we started writing this was following this like rapid, dramatic upheaval, the ripple effects of which were what Jesse is reporting on in the Farallones now. But I think I mean, for me, one of the things that sort of stuck with me that I'd been thinking about at Bay Nature a lot was there had been this period where science was accumulating knowledge, and you could use that knowledge to sort of predict things, to look into the future, and that you could see a place like the Farallones and the study we'd done there and the sort of biological work that people were doing and sort of building a little bit. And then you run into something where the change is happening so quickly and so dramatically, as the marine heat wave, the blob, 2013 to 2015-ish, the El Nino that followed, and it resets everything. And then you have researchers who will talk, when Jesse went out to the islands, just say, we don't quite know what's going to happen next. And I think that uncertainty is partly where someone like Kim Cobb, the scientist mentioned, is not sure. Sort of, look, we haven't communicated this in time to avoid that uncertainty, and so what should we do now? And then that question, I don't know the answer to that. Maybe Tessa knows the answer. She often does. But that uncertainty, I think, is the challenge of living right now, that everything is uncertain. And I don't know, Tessa, what do you think?
This is a great question, Kate, and I think that you asked like, does science need to change or something like that was your question, and I think the answer is that it already is, and I think that actually shows up for me in Bay Nature as a reader on a regular basis, not just in this issue, but I think that intersection of how scientific information is being called upon and used and even developed, in communities of people who want to work together to solve problems, to solve big, challenging problems. And I think that is a different, it's not that that type of science wasn't present before, but I think that type of science is really, having its time in the sun. And I think that's exactly what we need. I mean, I'm very biased towards that because it's the kind of science that I enjoy doing, but I think that the articles in Bay Nature speak to this, and the book speaks to this need for scientific knowledge to be deeply connected to society and to people, for us to sort of see those connections and enhance those connections.
Amazing segue into my next question, which is, you clearly wanted to talk about this deep and complex human connection with the ocean, and one way in which you do that is through Sachi Cunningham's story about her personal essay about the ocean. And I was just wondering, like, what was the conversation life like with Sachi when you were thinking about what you wanted for that part of the magazine, what you were hoping it would achieve?
I think, I mean, this is something Tessa and I had
Maybe
talked a
we
little.
should describe, maybe
Yeah,
I should just describe the story really
yeah, go for
briefly,
it.
which is Sachi's a surfer. She's a surf photographer and a filmmaker. She's very deeply connected to the ocean. And she goes and introduces her daughter to the water when her daughter is a toddler. And the daughter gets scared and she decides she hates the ocean. And Sachi starts really thinking about how she just starts meditating on what the ocean means and how do you actually get people to connect with it and love it. And sorry, I interrupted you.
No, I
Go
think
ahead.
that's exactly it. I mean, I when we were thinking about that piece, the magazine has this section where you want to connect people to what's there. And this was again the idea of the book is connection and finding meaning in the ocean. And so, I wanted, I think, to find something or a person who had a connection that they could express to the ocean itself. And Sachi's a surfer and a surf photographer, but she is also an ocean person. She has a connection to the ocean that I think she is uniquely able to express. That piece is beautiful. She's an amazing writer. She's an amazing photographer. I think you can see in her photographs too. She has just a sense of this place that most people don't, and is something really precious. And so part of what we were hoping, and part of what was just so amazing about working with her was, we could go and say, can you just tell people who may not know the ocean very well, how would you introduce someone to this place? You know this place super well. How would you tell them about it? Where would you take them? And she said, oh, well, I can tell you the story about how I took my daughter out the first time and how I built the connection with my daughter. It's like, oh yeah, that's exactly it. I mean, that's what you would do when you want to bring someone else along and you want them to love it the way that you love it. And so how do you tell that story? And then she just took it from there because she's watching, because she's amazing. And the piece that's in the magazine is the result. But I think it started with that idea of how do you build a connection? And I think that's the bigger idea that Tessa and I were thinking about a lot in the book is, how do you build a connection to the ocean? How do you reach the broader world and start to build a sort of global community of ocean people? How do you connect the people who are connected already to the ocean, and how do you make it so that what they're saying reaches more people and takes hold in more people?
So you guys had done a whole book's worth of reporting over who knows how many years, 6 plus. And then you decided to do this issue and you sent out some reporters to collect some more information. Did anybody come back with anything that surprised or particularly delighted you, or that you learned um, that you hadn't learned in your book reporting? Or yeah.
I may answer that because I'm probably more easily surprised than Tessa. But Tessa, go ahead if you've got one.
Well, I mean, um this is hard for me because I sort of love everything that's in that issue, and so I don't want to pick favorite, but um I will say that the article about deep sea exploration and how we are merging, new technologies and the curiosity of people around the world with trying to understand the deep sea, I particularly loved. And I sort
Mhm.
of referenced this earlier, but I think it's the kind of thing that I would have loved to have that story in our book if we had just had another year to report on the book. So it feels like the kind of thing that I was like, like, darn, I'm like bummed that we didn't get that. We didn't squeeze that deep sea story in. We squeezed some other deep sea stories in. But this idea that technology and harnessing people's curiosity for the natural world does show up in the book quite a lot, and so I was really excited to see. That story starts out featuring Jim Barry, who's at Mbari, who plays a significant role in our book as well, and then that story moves on to feature Kakani Katia's work at Mbari, looking at sort of gamifying how we look at the deep sea. And I just think it's a great merge of people's curiosities and a place in the ocean that we don't know a lot about.
Hmm. I want to go back to our little local patch of ocean, the San Francisco Bay Area and environs, and put them in global context a little bit more, because I get a lot of information coming at me about these waters, and it always occurs to me how wealthy we are in the brain trust that is studying these waters, and in dollar terms. And yet, at the same time, you have your sea stars wasting away, your kelp forests just like decimated. And yet, the whales are coming back. The bay is healthier. People have gotten sea stars and abalones to make babies in labs. So, how do you? I think summary is really hard, but how is this place representative of what is happening globally, and how is it a special case because of some of those things? Are there parts of the magazine that sort of bring that to the fore for you?
Um, I mean, a couple of answers. I think it's representative in its complexity, that it is, a place where lots of good things are happening and lots of amazing people are doing brilliant work. People who care a lot are producing, insights and understanding and communication and sort of beauty about the ocean here that has sort of global significance or global appeal. And at the same time, like you say, there is a limit to what sort of we can do in small groups or individually. Um, again, probably one of the ideas in the book is that without sort of wider societal collective action, you can't defend your territory, your piece of turf against the changes that are taking place globally. That you can do a lot locally, but you can't do everything. And I think that shows up in the book repeatedly, especially talking about, coral, which is very, in some ways, sort of the coral reefs, the tropics, very different from what we have here, and yet a very
Mm-hmm.
similar idea that ultimately you can give quite good local protection and still not fully protect something. And that's
Mm-hmm.
just something to get used to, but we're in a good place to get used to it.
Mm.
Yeah, if I can just add to that, I would say like the context of every article in the Bay Nature issue sort of rests on a place that is highly protected. And So we're really, really fortunate in California to have both national marine sanctuaries as well as a network of marine protected areas that, you know, these networks sort of serve as what you can think of as sort of marine parks, and they don't prohibit every activity, but they do prohibit some activities within those areas. And that protection, you know, what we see over and over again in our reporting for the book is what Eric just said, which is that protection goes a very long way. Like, we actually need some ability to conserve and restore and manage habitats into the future. It also only takes you so far, because some of the global pressures on these places are so big that, you know, even our local protections may not be enough, but we have to start somewhere. And I think we're very lucky to live in a place that has thought very deeply and very collectively about how to conserve marine environments.
Hmm. Well, I want to zoom out to the book. We've kind of been gliding that way seamlessly, and talk about. I want to first just talk a little bit about the pace of change on a global scale, and was wondering if you kind of have any go-to examples that you use when people are like, what do you mean it's changing fast? Like, what are the kind of key things that you think of? And I'll just, for everybody who's here today, I'll give you a quote from the book to give these guys a little moment to think, which is, "The ocean has changed so fast in the last few years, faster than at any point in the entirety of human life on Earth, that our ability to observe struggles to keep pace. Marine scientists now sometimes say that the ocean itself is approaching some new uncertain threshold, as if it has fallen off the edge of the map." So what do you think of when you think of that, like the what's changing so fast?
Eric, I'm wondering if you want to sort of retell the story about how we stumbled into this project, because it a little bit answers that question.
Yeah, I mean, I
Yeah.
think, and then I'll let Tessa, who will have more sort of current statistics. But I think one of the ways we started thinking about this was I was working at Bay Nature, and we went through this remarkable drought on land. And as I sort of mentioned at the beginning, you see things on land. We saw the drought on land, and I just wondered, okay, why is this happening? And I started going to people, and they said, because the ocean is influencing our weather, and the ocean is probably influencing the rainfall pattern. And there's this state in the tropical East Pacific or tropical West Pacific. And so there was all this complex stuff happening in the ocean, and people just kept saying the ocean, the ocean, the ocean. So I started going to ocean conferences. And 2 or 3 years into this, had started to realize, there was all this stuff happening on land associated with this drought and with the heat waves on land. And the same stuff was happening in the ocean too. And this all sort of crystallized in that quote. I went to an ocean conservation conference at the Fort Mason Center in San Francisco, and there were sort of people from around Northern California presenting there, on their work, sort of trying to understand what was happening in the ocean after 2 or 3 years of extremes. And one person put up this big slide that said, "No analog ecosystem." And you're sort of sitting and thinking and making sense of that. And then he puts up the next slide, which says, "We're off the map." It was like, oh, well, that seems like a big deal. And that's, I think, for me, when I sort of thought about this as something maybe more than a magazine piece, and it was like, this is a project to understand this. But then in terms
Mhm.
of capturing how quickly it's changing, I know, Tessa, what would you add there?
Well, I'll add two things, and one of them is from the book, and one of them is from yesterday. So keeping this very current. I think that Eric and I started having all of these conversations about how hard it is to describe to people how fast things are changing. It's just like what was referenced at the beginning of this discussion. People imagine the ocean to be a vast expanse that's unchanging, even though our life experience on land is that things have changed quite a lot in our own lifetimes. And so we, began trying to have these conversations with people around the world, scientists and fishermen and indigenous community members and conservation groups, and simply asking them, if you wanted to try to describe to other people what you see, how fast things are changing, how would you describe it? And that is sort of the core of the book, is the answer to that question, but it's a whole bunch of people answering the question, not us. So that's
Yeah.
one thing. I'll just add that I was at a scientific conference yesterday where people were presenting, very recent events that have happened in the ocean and in the San Francisco Bay. And we were all kind of talking about how we could learn lessons from these events that are happening in warm intervals. And do we assume that what we'll see in the future will just be more and more and more of that, like more and more of what we have lived through already? And I think that's actually a flawed assumption, because I think we are headed, as Eric just said, into this no analog territory, right? So it's not simply that it's going to be an extreme version or a repeated version of what we've seen in the environment for the past 10 years. We're actually going to move into a system that our imaginations even have a hard time coping with. And coming up with.
Mm-hmm. That leads me to another quote that I pulled out, which is near the end when you're talking about your hopefulness. You describe raising white abalone and releasing them into the wild to go make more abalone. And you say the problems we face today do not, in fact, represent a static condition, but rather, we hope, a turning point. And that was like an important sentence for me to read as a inherently pessimistic person. And I wanted to ask you how you talk about just how you thought about how you managed reporting on all of this tough stuff. There's a lot of coral death and whale death in the book, and very sad coral scientists. How you managed the tone, like how you thought about what you wanted to get across, and like, did you feel like you had to be hopeful for it to be palatable to readers, or were you literally just hopeful all the time?
No. um, um,
Tell me about the emotional journey a little bit.
yeah. No, I mean, I think, look, this is part of what is lucky about co-writing a book is I think one of us was hopeful at different points most of the time. Um, so that made it nice.
I mean, it is a hopeful book ultimately.
I I think, there's different answers to this. And the book, I mean, we talked to a lot of people and we asked a lot of people this question too. And so sometimes I feel like who cares what I think about this? I would say I think there's a lot of different ways to keep acting. And when you go look for people, you will find so many people doing so many amazing things, and that the book highlights so many of them that it's hard not to feel, in some sense, maybe I'm compartmentalizing, but you just come up with a list of 300 pages of here's a person doing something great, and here's a person doing something great, and here's a person doing something great. And I mean, in an oddly contrary sort of way, it reminds me of one of the stories in the book about this restoration project in Australia. Which I think has some resonance in the Bay Area, where they had somebody, a historical ecologist in Sydney area, had discovered that they used to have a lot of kelp in the harbor, and it wasn't there anymore, and nobody quite knew how it disappeared, but it was gone. And then they figured out, okay, we're going to put it back.
I know it's called Crabie or something like that.
Crayweed. Yeah, crayweed. And
Crayweed,
so they
sorry.
came up with the catchy marketing phrase of craybees, which were their baby
Right, Crabie.
crayweeds. Um,
Oh my God.
and they went out and they planted them, and it took, and they kept doing it, and it spread. And they faced this situation of like, how do you convince anyone that there is some good news out there. So I think we thought about that sometimes. Like, yeah, there's a lot going on. We don't want to ignore the bad news, but we also want to convince you a little bit that look at these people. Look what they're doing. Look at these people. Look what you could do. Look what anyone can do. Just build a little connection, build a little community, build a little bit more. Like look what everyone is doing here. And that feels, I don't know if that's hopeful, but it feels actionable, which to me is important. Like I want
Yeah.
you to feel like you can do something. And I think all the people in the book that we talked to are doing something. And that I think to me maybe it ties together, but that was important. I think that's one of the ways I thought about it. But Tessa, what I don't know. Tell us more.
Yeah, I mean, this is sort of one of my favorite stories about the book is how we landed on that as the ending, the story of the White Abalone Restoration Program. And I want you all to get to the end of the book, so I'm not going to tell you the whole story. I'm not going to give it away, but I'll tell you that it is hopeful. I agree with Kate. But Eric and I had spent quite a bit of time writing basically the first chapter of the book and then a very detailed outline. And we were in the process of trying to sell the book to a publisher. And in that process, someone who we trusted said to us, I think you're going to have to write the end of the book. And at least I at the time was like, what do you mean you have to write the end of the book? Like, all we have is the beginning and an outline. Like, how can I write the end of the book? Like, I don't know
Hmm.
where the middle is yet. And this
They
person,
wanted to know where you were going.
this person said to us, I think to sell this book, you are going to have to convince people that it is not all doom and gloom. So, in answer to your question, Kate, I mean, I don't think we felt obligated to be hopeful all the time, but we were very aware of this issue. You can't ask people to read a book like this that's like nothing but sad news, right? So we were fortunate, and again, I don't want to give away the story, but we were fortunate to sort of have access to this story, this success story about a species on the brink of extinction that is finding its way back. And it's finding its way back because of the sort of remarkable and unlikely partnerships between a whole host of people who have fought for this species. And in fact, the last words of the book are a poem written by a colleague of mine who was running that program at the time. And that poem basically says to us, we're going to save this species because the future of our own species is intertwined with this one. And that, when Eric and I ran across that story, we were like, this story is the whole book. The whole book is about how we are going to work together through very difficult challenges in unlikely partnerships because our future is intertwined with the future of the ocean. And that's what the book is about. And so then it was like, well, there's the end of the book. And I'll just say the other
And
thing that Eric just reminded me is that so I'm a climate scientist. Like, that's what I do. That's my day job. I do a lot of public speaking about climate change. And the most common question I get is, how do you stay hopeful? And so I will just share with you what I tell other people in those settings, which is that I don't wake up hopeful in the morning. Hope is like a muscle. It's something we activate. It's something we do. I actively do things on a daily basis, including having conversations like this that bring me hope. So hope is not something passive for me. And I think what Eric said is absolutely correct. The book is filled with examples of people who are doing something about these problems, and that gives me hope.
perfect time for questions. Leah, are you gonna tell us how it works?
Yeah, so I'll be calling on people. Please, those of you listening with your questions, don't hold back. Just type them in the chat, and then I will call on you, and then you can unmute and ask your questions out loud, and then we can engage that way. But let's see. It looks like we have one question from Connor. Connor, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, so my question was pretty much just like Mr. Eric Simmons. You mentioned building like those little communities, and I was just kind of curious, like, what do you really mean by that?
find other people who have the same interests, find something that you can do, and go do it. I mean, that sounds simpler, but if you're in an AP environmental science class, like you have amazing knowledge already, you have friends who have that knowledge too, you have caring, you have an ocean nearby if you're local. I think you could use, like, if you're in an AP environmental science class, like, call some of the marine conservation organizations around and ask them, like, what are problems you're working on? And you could use your talent to solve all sorts of things. I mean, it's funny, I'm actually coming from an event where one of my kids is presenting like an ocean solution, and they went to the Marine Mammal Center and they just asked, like, what's something that could be solved? Okay, let us go think about it. And I think there's that, like, I guess, Connor, don't wait for people to like come up with stuff. Go find things, because you're bright and you're in AP environmental science and you're talented. Like, you can figure it out. Go do it.
Awesome. Thank you.
We also have a question from Rick. Rick, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Hi, Eric. Good to see you, Tessa. Can't wait to read your book, especially the bit on historical ecology, which is my fancy. Speaking of historical ecology, sea otter used to thrive in San Francisco Bay, where if they could be brought back, they'd likely revive the eelgrass beds as they have in Elkhorn Slough. I've been asking U.S. Fish and Wildlife for sea otter to be restored to the bay for 15 years. How do we influence this?
I don't actually I don't have an easy answer for this. I suspect that you know as much about this as I do, and I think, you know, contacting state agencies and our elected officials is a good way to, make your concerns known about that. My understanding is that that is being considered. So I think that people are trying to understand both scientifically but also impacts on fishermen, sort of what that relocation would look like. And so I don't think it's out of the question, but it's obviously something that has to be very carefully considered by state and federal agencies, as you alluded to.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for your question, Rick. Are there any other questions? Please continue dropping them in the chat. In the meanwhile, I have a question. I'm wondering, when you were writing your book, how hard was it to pick the specific anecdotes that you included, and how much was left unincluded, and how did you make those calls, and how much is left to, continue publishing at some point?
We took out the Rachel Carson biography that we were writing and are saving that for the next next go round.
Book number 2.
Book number 2. I mean, that's always, I mean, the most fun part of doing this is, again, like, we shared links in a Slack channel for 8 years. There's probably 100,000 words of Slack dialogue and links and neat things that we found. And so much of it that it's hard to remember. I mean, I think there's lovely stories about the past human connection to the ocean. There's some great stories about just fisheries, and some great stories about coral. Like everywhere you go, the more you look into it, just the more not to be silly about it, but like the more wonderful a world it is. Like, there's just neat stuff everywhere, and there's great people doing great stuff everywhere, and it's really hard to pick what you put in and what you leave out, especially if you've talked it over so much. I don't know, Tessa, is there anything that stands out for you there?
No, it's a lovely question, Leah. And actually, until you said that, it hadn't really dawned on me that we could like pull all that stuff that we didn't write about together and write about it. Yeah, it was hard. I think it was, many years, like Eric said, of us writing messages to each other about, should we include this, and can we leave this in? Is this too far off? And I think one of the hardest parts actually was stopping because after 6 years of doing that, we had to come to a point where we were like, okay, we're going to stop editing this and we have to turn over a final version. And in that moment, it almost becomes a little bit out of date because we can no longer update it with like the newest thing that came out. And so I do think there's a piece of me that, working on something for that long, then not working on it is hard, actually.
Thank you. Wow. We have a question from Eden. Yeah, Eden,
Good evening, all. Yes, thank you so much for hosting this wonderful conversation here. I don't know the name of your book, and I really want to know it. And I have a question for you about just by reading the book, do you feel that I will get inspired to take some of these subjects to elementary schools, for instance, in Marin County? And the last piece is I'm so grateful to see young people here on this Zoom call. I spend a lot of time on Zoom calls around solutions, and it's beautiful to watch these young faces alive and bright and so ready. So yes, please go ahead.
I would say, so the book is called At Every Depth, and there is, I put a link in the chat, a couple chat messages up. And I think, so I've heard, I know several high school students who have read it. And I at the time that we were writing it, I had a middle schooler, and he actually was the first person to read the whole thing from start to finish. And even provided Eric and I some edits. So I feel very confident that a middle schooler and a high schooler could read it on their own. For elementary school content, I think you absolutely would be able to pull content out of it and use in your classroom. And I'm so thrilled that you're doing that work. And maybe there's some way that we can talk about having you connect with Bodega Marine Lab or something like that, since we're not too far away. But yes, I think there are local topics, and then there's also global topics that I think are very approachable for K-12 students. I don't know if you have anything to add on that, Eric.
Yeah, I'm reminded because I wrote this piece for Bay Nature a long time ago and I always loved it. But Terry Gosliner, who is a scientist at the California Academy of Sciences and studies nudibranchs, and Gary Williams, who's a senior scientist at the California Academy of Sciences, studies deep sea corals. Both started out loving the ocean and studying the ocean as high school students in Marin. They discovered a new species of nudibranch as high school juniors or seniors. Terry just never stopped. He kept discovering new species of nudibranchs. But I think, again, the ocean is here and we're lucky for it. And there are discoveries out there to be made for all of us.
Well, and thank you. And when you said that the changes that we're seeing now are unlike anything in the entire life of the ocean, can you speak to that a little bit right now?
Yeah, I mean, I'll speak to that a little bit from sort of the perspective of an Earth. I study climate change, past, present, future, and so, I mean, we can say with quite a lot of certainty that the rates of change that we are seeing on the planet today exceed anything that we can reconstruct from the geologic record. So how fast things are changing is truly remarkable, and we don't actually have an example to look back at in the geologic record to understand what happens when the earth changes as fast as it is today. And that, of course, applies to the ocean as well. And when we're thinking about those changes, we can reconstruct things like temperature and how much ice has covered the Earth's surface. We also can look at things like oxygen or chemistry through time, and we see very consistent. We can see a lot of examples of change through the geologic record that we can learn from, but none of them match what we are experiencing today in terms of anthropogenic human-caused climate change.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Eden, for your questions. And looks like we have a question from Ted about sea stars. Ted, do you want to unmute and ask your question? I'm also happy to ask it, I think. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead, Ted.
I was just curious about what your thoughts are about the sea star recovery off the Point Reyes coast after the blob and the toxins and so on. What do you think is going to happen?
Ted, are you specifically asking about the sunflower sea star, or are you thinking about sea stars in general?
Well, the sunflower are the ones that we're most worried about, I think. So sure, address those. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. My understanding is that in general, a lot of the sea stars have made a comeback. And in fact, I just put a link in the chat for an organized, initiative that the California Academy of Sciences is doing to actually, track and monitor sea stars along the coast. And you can participate in that and contribute community science to that data set. So I encourage you all to do that. Also, at the California Academy of Sciences, there are folks working on the sunflower star recovery. The sunflower star is sort of on the path to be listed as an endangered species because it did not recover after that event that you were referring to. And so, probably the future of that species resides in our ability to successfully raise it in laboratory settings and repopulate the natural system with some of those cultured sea stars. And the good news is that there are scientists in Washington and California actually having some success at raising them in laboratory settings. And so, I'm optimistic that it will be another one of those success stories like the white abalone. But it's earlier days. And by the way, one of the interesting things about that is that all of those scientists know each other and share a lot of knowledge about how we recover species from the brink of extinction. So there's a lot of community support for trying to bring these species back.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I think maybe one last question can be for people who are interested in keeping tabs on changing ocean. Like changing ocean is such a huge and vast topic, but what are like reading your book and then reading our issue, of course, but also what are some ways that people can keep tabs with oceans in their own life on a day-to-day basis and try to, stay up to date with changes in their own lives?
I mean, the lovely thing about the ocean is there's a lot of opportunity for everyone to find your own path there. I mean, I think some of the ones, we'll go back to where I started, like one of the ones I favor is the link that Tessa put in the chat just now, that join any kind of community science group. That there's a coastal snapshot in the summer when the tides are low. There's a winter sea star search, just going out to the coast and helping to look and document connects you and is also just remarkably satisfying and interesting experience, and provides some useful data to people trying to look and track where things are going and where things are moving. So it's one very rapid way to connect. But I think you could choose. I mean, I've talked to bay swimmers. You could go swimming in the bay every day. You could go swimming in the ocean every day, and just you'll notice change that way. You could hike the coast every day, and you'll notice change. And I think part of it is finding your own connection, but keeping it once you have it.
I'd like to make a plug for this part of at the end of Sachi's story on her letter of recommendation of the ocean. There's a sidebar on if you've ever wanted to get into ocean swimming or surfing and those kind of things, and especially if you're not necessarily like if you're a person of color, you're queer, or you're like other underrepresented groups, Sachi has listed some groups that can help you get started with that.
Awesome. I think that's a great place to wrap up because we are at 8 p.m. But thank you all for joining. And if you don't mind, we can just really briefly unmute and say thank you to our speakers today. I'll count us down from 3, go 3, 2, 1, and we'll say thank you. Okay. 3, 2, 1. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
so
you.
much. Yeah, thank you all for being here. And if you're interested in more of that, please please consider signing up as a Bay Nature member. I'll include all of the links that were in the chat today in the follow-up email with the recording. Thank you all for being here, sharing your evening with us, and biggest thanks to Eric and Tessa for sharing their expertise, for guest editing our issue, and for publishing an amazing book. So thank you all for being
Thank
here,
you
and
so
have a
much.
great night, everybody.